So, I bought a boat and a house. This channel is mainly about boat though, and the myriad of projects, big and small, required to save and improve her. So, welcome to Saving Ophelia. Last time we went over Ophelia's current condition and what I know about her background. This time we're going to have a look at what I did to get her ready for her first trip in at least 8 years. So, let's get started. The first thing I did after buying Ophelia was to pump out all the water that had accumulated in her old water tank. Now, being a steel construction, she shouldn't really take on any water, but she does have a few construction issues, which we will handle over time, that does let in a bit of water. I estimate that she'd taken on about a couple of 100 liters of water while just lying still in the harbor, and that obviously had to go. And we've seemed to have hit the bottom. Well, turned out to be too good to be true. It seems that the tank is split in two, and that part was draining into this when that one hit the bottom, so oh well, more pumping to do. With the stowaway water gone, I started poking around a bit to see how bad the damage to the hull really was. Well, that was my intention at least, because it turned out I couldn't access the hull other than two small strips right next to the water tank. So this is kind of what I need to dig through to get onto the top of the water tank to see how bad this damage really is and how far it extends. It seems to stop there, but can't really trust what's behind here before I've had a look at it and seeing how corroded everything is. I'll probably have to dig out, well, cut out the entire top of the tank and replace it with new. But I guess we'll see. And everything here needs to come out to access behind this. Oh well, guess that's boats for you. And the water tank was done for. Very bad, you've seen it rusted through. And I suspected that the areas right next to the water tank would probably be the worst affected. And they didn't look too bad, not really. They were clearly corroded, but not badly so. Unfortunately, I couldn't go any further because everything else was hidden behind cupboards and under the floor. So I could access where there were hatches though, or so I thought, because I opened the small hatch I showed you earlier and I found one of the 3 through holes for the boat with valves. And the valve for that one, the galley sink, was completely stuck, just like the one for the toilet and the head. The only valve that actually worked was the one for the engine cooling, well, luckily enough. Now, I thought I might be able to access the hull through that hatch as well, but it turned out that everything was covered in fiberglass. Not exactly ideal. So, seeing that I would have to rip everything out in order to get any further with this, I decided to go do something else for a while. Poking around the boat like this obviously requires tools, and I really like my electrical tools. So, rather than dragging them back and forth all the time, I wanted to leave them at the boat. But the companionway doors couldn't really close properly. There's a lip at the bottom edge of the doors that's supposed to prevent them from opening inwards, and that had been smashed up, so of course the door had opened inwards at some point and ruined the hinges. Now the hinges had been replaced, but it hadn't been done properly, so now the doors would meet outside of the boat and you had to force them in, and well, they would get really and truly stuck if you did that, and you still couldn't lock them. So I had to fix that. I did that by, well, dismounting everything and then sinking the hinges into the door and the frame around it. Considering how long Ophelia had been lying in the water, just about 8 years, I really wanted to have a hold out so I could have a good look at her hull, just to make sure that there were no major corrosion issues visible from the outside. See, the deal I made when I bought Ophelia had a clause that allowed me to let the deal go back if I found corrosion issues that affected the structural integrity. And, well, those kind of clauses are use it or lose it deals. If I waited for too long, I risked getting stuck with a hull that had issues. So I needed Ophelia out of the water. In order to get out of the water, I needed to get her to the mariner's crane. And for that, I needed steering and propulsion. So with the tank emptied and the companionway fixed, I set about looking at the engine and the steering. When I got Ophelia, she had neither propulsion nor steering. Well, strictly speaking, she did, but both systems had been taken apart and not been put back together again, so we definitely weren't going anywhere under our own power. I figured that we would probably be able to get help towing, but Ophelia isn't exactly lightweight, so getting anywhere in a controlled manner, even with towing, would be pretty hard without steering. So I made re-establishing steering my first priority. Ophelia's got an hydraulic steering system, which means that the steering wheel is connected to a pump that moves oil through some connecting lines to a piston that then actuates the rudder. It's a really good system, but the pump needs to work quite perfectly, otherwise you get a lot of slop and things don't really work. And the original pump had been unmounted from the steering pedestal because it was broken. A new one had been acquired and was stored somewhere on the boat. Somewhere turned out to be at the bottom of a locker in the salon underneath a lot of unrelated stuff, and finding that pump unsurprisingly turned out to be the easy part. I started taking measurements on the hydraulic system in order to find the items I would need to connect the new pump to the old hydraulic system, and the measurements didn't make sense. I couldn't find stuff that fitted. Not entirely true. Some measurements fitted quite nicely with stuff I could find online, while others, and well, unfortunately important ones, didn't. So there was no way I could find to interface the two systems. It turns out, though, that frustrating as this was, there's a good explanation as to why. Because in 1992, when Ophelia had her last major refit, Denmark was apparently in the process of trying to get rid of the last vestiges of an old measurement system that used units like tommer, quite literally thumbs, and was quite closely related to inches. At any rate, this didn't work because both systems are still around today, but at this point, one of the places where the old systems were still used was obviously hydraulics. So Ophelia's systems are a mixture of old units and the new metric ones. Yeah, we can't have things getting too easy now, can we? During this frustration with the mismatching measurement systems, yeah, it's quite a tongue twister, it turns out that I'd been mistaken. Not the first time, probably not the last either, because while Ophelia's 18 tons were just too much for the mariner's small red dinghy, DSRS, the Danish Sea Rescue Society, had one of their boats stationed at the marina. It wasn't a big boat, but it had two massive engines on the back. They had oodles of control, so moving a boat like Ophelia around wouldn't be a problem. And they were more than willing to help. They just made a small training exercise out of it and took Ophelia from a slip and moved her over to the crane, and easy as pie. Unfortunately, I didn't get around to recording any of this because, well, I was too busy fretting around being nervous. But these guys were just so on top of their game. And they should be, because usually they do their towing out on the open sea when people get in trouble, so having any issues inside an enclosed marina would be truly surprising. At any rate, being true good Samaritans, they didn't want any payment for the help, not for themselves or their organization. I decided to put a bit of money towards their Christmas party, though. The day after the tow, Ophelia was hauled out. This was quite uneventful, as once again I had help by people who knew their stuff. Ophelia is a bit on the heavy side, and the wind was no help at all, but all in all, getting Ophelia in position in the slings was fairly easy. The only real surprise in this part of the operation was the amount of growth on Ophelia's hull. It was almost like an underwater garden down there. And considering how long Ophelia had been lying still, I don't know how much of a surprise that really was. While she hung in the slings, I cleaned Ophelia's hull, and off came lots and lots of mussels and button paint with them. There was even a few good-sized oysters in there. When all the growth was gathered up afterwards, I had scraped somewhere between 600 and 800 litres of mussels and other assorted creepy crawlies off the hull. That'd be somewhere between 130 and 175 gallons if you're that way inclined. Unfortunately, all of this fresh seafood was probably inedible. The water in the harbour isn't exactly clean, and I'm also guessing that neither bottom paint nor anti-fouling is really a valuable part of a balanced diet. After cleaning the hull, it was time to move Ophelia to a spot on the Hard where she could stay while I worked on her, but of course reality once again had other plans. When a boat has been lifted by the crane, the marina personnel will use a slipway trailer to move the boat around and set it down in the right spot. However, Ophelia's hull shape became an issue here. Slender as she is, the trailer could grab Ophelia from the crane when on maximum extension, but once she had been set down somewhere, the trailer wouldn't be able to lift her back up again. Not exactly ideal, so back in the water she went, after a careful examination of her hull and rudder, of course. We did avoid having to tow Ophelia again though, because the harbour master fortunately allowed us to stay moored at a spot near to the crane, a spot which was usually reserved for bigger boats, the 15 meters plus kind, or those over 49 feet. I had to promise to keep working on Ophelia though, and to try to get her ready to move under her own power again. Up till this point the plan had been that Ophelia would stay on the Hard while she was being fixed up, and then moved elsewhere when she was ready to go back in. There was a long waiting list, 5 years or so, for slips at the marina we were at, and we could only use our current slip until the start of the next season. So a spot on the Hard was a nice replacement option while we worked on Ophelia. When it turned out that Ophelia couldn't be moved around on land though, that plan kind of went out the window. So with a deadline in the not too distant future, I once again set to work trying to get propulsion and steering up and running. The new steering pump, the one I found in the locker, is made by the Italian brand Ultraflex, and it's designed to be used with flexible polymer lines rather than the old-fashioned copper lines Ophelia's fitted with. Also, the pump was made this century, so it's metric, while Ophelia wasn't, and quite a few of the parts aren't metric. So interfacing these two, as I described earlier, wasn't exactly easy, and with my level of knowledge, I couldn't find what I needed online. So I visited the local chandlery, and local is quite literal here, it's 50 meters from where Ophelia was moored. And they had a rough idea what it might need, but they weren't able to help because, well, they didn't have any of the items. So they pointed me to another chandlery, which couldn't help, and sent me to another one, which couldn't help, and, well, you get the idea. And I toured quite a few chandleries in this way before I gave up, frustrated, and started doing something else. Then a couple of days later I needed another item, and I went to the chandlery again, and the guy I talked to this time, who obviously hadn't been working the first time, knew exactly what I needed when we started talking about the hydraulics. He also knew that his company couldn't order it in a reasonable time frame, but he knew where I could get it, and he pointed me to a small hydraulics company at the outskirts of Copenhagen. He said they were quick and they knew what they were doing, and they had quite a lot of items in their storage. So I visited them, and he was right. They quickly whipped together a couple of lines for me, and then they started picking the items I needed from the warehouse. But they came up short. They were missing one item that I would need two of. But they knew where to find it. The guy who made the lines, his previous employer, is a much bigger company, and they had, he said, everything you would ever need for hydraulics in their warehouse. But they also closed down for the weekend. So a couple of days later I returned, and they did find the item I need. They had two. I got lucky, just those two. So with loot in hand, I returned to Ophelia to start installing the pump. Actually connecting the new pump to the old lines turned out to be surprisingly easy, with the right fittings in hand, of course. The flared ends of the old lines were cut, taking care not to get any debris from the cutting into the lines, because if that happened it would mess things up later. And then I removed the runners that used to keep the lines fixed to the old pump, and then I could just press the new self-cutting fitting in place on the copper line. With this fitting in place, the new flexible lines would simply screw in place with just a bit of Teflon tape to keep everything tight. With the right connectors mounted to the lines, the next step was mounting the pump onto the pedestal. The old pump had been mounted inside the pedestal with a shaft poking through for mounting the wheel, and that was basically it. The new one had to be mounted outside of the pedestal, with the back end of the pump poking inside the pedestal through a fairly substantial hole. And there were two issues with this. One, there was already a hole, which meant that I couldn't use an ordinary hole saw with a center drill to guide it. I had to find another way to cut this hole because there was nothing for the center drill to dig into. And two, the pedestal is made from fairly substantial stainless steel, and stainless steel work hardens like nobody's business. The solution to the first problem turned out to be some out-of-the-box thinking. More precisely, an old floorboard out of my leftovers box. I cut a hole through the floorboard with a hole saw, and then I mounted the floorboard in the right place on the pedestal. Then I could use that as a guide for the hole saw until I had got a good groove going. Then I could lose the whole board. The work hardening thing though, well, the solution turned out to be liberal amounts of cutting fluid, a lot of persistence, and spiced up with just a hint of frustration. Now, the cutting process might have benefited from me owning more than one bimetal hole saw, but apparently I'm a cheapskate and would rather moan, curse and complain while I'm wearing down the teeth of a hole saw completely than having to buy a new hole saw midway through the cut. At any rate, the hole did get cut, and then I drilled 4 smaller holes around it for the mounting screws for the pump at the low price of just a handful of broken drills. At this point though, I developed a rather hefty loathing for working stainless steel. With the pump in place and the lines connected and the wheel mounted, we had steering, or so I thought. It turned out though that when I turned the wheel, nothing happened, and if I pumped enough, it would start to generate a popping feeling and oil would start seeping from the lines leading out of the pump. And well, when we had the boat on the heart, I checked the rudder to see if it moved freely, and it did. So the problem obviously had to be the piston that actuated the rudder, right? Yeah, I removed the piston and took it apart, and it worked perfectly. Nothing. So the problem had to lie elsewhere. I started tracing the hydraulic lines, which I probably should have done from the start, and I came upon this. I had no idea what this was, but there was some text on it, so Google to the rescue. And it turns out that this is a valve, and it's a real dope moment because this serves as a bypass valve, allowing the oil to go directly from one end of the piston to the other. If the pump for some reason locks up or if the lines are blocked, then the rudder can still move freely, which is quite useful. But yeah, it turns out, of course, that there was nothing wrong with the system. I just needed to find the handle for the valve and open it. After remounting the piston and refilling the system with oil, of course, and then we had steering. So onto propulsion. Ophelia is equipped with a Vetus P425 engine. It's a 62 horsepower diesel engine, and that means it's a Peugeot engine that's been adapted for marine use by Vetus. It's a freshwater cooled engine, means that it has two cooling circuits, one where fresh water circulates through the engine and cools it directly, and then a second circuit where seawater is used to cool this fresh water in a heat exchanger. But when we got Ophelia, there were no hoses, anything mounted for the fresh water to circulate through. So, well, while we could run the engine, as my brother the engineer said, we couldn't run it for long, and definitely not long enough to actually get anywhere. The 425's original heat exchanger had corroded through at some point, and this is apparently a quite normal issue for these engines. So it had been replaced with the Bowman EH200. And the Bowman heat exchangers are quite pricey and really excellent. But this one had been mounted in a slightly, let's say, creative fashion. An aluminium profile had been cut to length, and then pieces had been cut out of it before it was mounted onto the engine. The holes were to allow the engine to still breathe with this bracket in place. Then the heat exchanger had just been mounted onto this aluminium bracket. And then the project had stalled, which was why there were no hoses attached to circulate cooling fluid, anything. Now, I had my brother go over the engine, and he poked around a bit, and, well, as much as you can without disassembling the engine completely, and it seemed to be surprisingly healthy. So I set about mounting a new coolant circulation system. Mounting a coolant circulation system sounds quite fancy, doesn't it? What it really was me cutting hoses to length, mounting them in place, and then chasing drips and leaks. The only slightly complicated part of this was finding out what diameter hose to use where, and where I absolutely had to use high temperature hose. High temperature hose is quite a bit more expensive than the other ones, and I ended up playing it safe and mounting high temperature on both sides of the heat exchanger, so leading out of the engine and into the engine. Besides the price, another point is that the high temperature hose isn't see-through, so I couldn't see whether or not a cooling liquid was circulating through the heat exchanger and into the engine, but I guessed that I would be able to feel if the temperature was rising, and, well, yeah, that one would come back to bite me later. At any rate, with other hoses in place and almost all drips found, we refilled the system, the reservoir and the hoses with cooling liquid. Really just demineralized water with a few additives. And then my brother and I started the engine for the first time.
Okay. Yep.
I've mentioned my brother a few times, and it sounds like I relied on him quite a bit because, well, I did. I don't know a lot about engines or mechanical systems in general. Well, not entirely true. I do know a lot about them, but that's theoretical knowledge. When it comes to practice, that's a whole nother ballgame. And I like having people around who know what they are doing, if nothing else to avoid me messing things up. And in this case, it's my youngest brother, well, the youngest of my two younger brothers, and he's an engineer to the second degree. He's a chemical engineer, but he's also trained as the kind of engineers whose job it is to keep the engines going on the big ships when they sail around the world. So he knows a lot about engines, and that comes in quite handy when there are issues with mine, even though it is on the smallest side for him. At any rate, when we started the engine, it ran perfectly. Almost perfectly. a lot of vibrations started happening, and it was the heat exchanger that started rocking back and forth quite violently. The issue was the bracket the heat exchanger was mounted on. All the pieces that had been cut out of this piece of aluminium left it quite flexible. Not a good thing in this case, so it could really move back and forth a lot. We could dampen out the vibrations by putting a hand or foot on the heat exchanger. That would dampen it out completely, but still it wasn't a good thing. But she ran, and for the first time in at least 8 years, probably longer, Ophelia could move under her own power. She didn't have very far to go, she just moved from her mooring place into a slip, but she moved under her own power. Thank you for once again tagging along with me in this tale of Ophelia's resurrection. Next week I'm going to go over Ophelia's first long trip in many years, the 163 nautical miles from Copenhagen to Marstal. I had planned to do that in this episode, but it simply turned out too long. So please remember to click the subscribe button so you don't miss my next upload. And also please do click the like button. If you made it this far, I probably didn't bore you completely out of your mind. See you next time.